It has been related further on the same day that the madman entered diverse churches and there sang a requiem, Aeternam Deo. Let out and quieted, he said to have retorted each time, what are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of a dead God? God is dead, we have killed him. You know, the irony of Nietzsche's life is that the last 14 years of his life he spent in an insane asylum himself. And his mother was a godly woman who'd sit by his bedside, and he would go into weeks and weeks and weeks of silence, and suddenly would burst out with some words. And you know what they would invariably be? Words of scripture which he'd memorized as a younger boy. An irony to what he's saying. Is there any up or down left? Must we not have to light lanterns in the morning hours because we have wiped away the entire horizon and erased any points of measurement? There's a poet who wrote this. First, dentistry was painless, then bicycles were chainless, and carriages were horseless, and many laws enforceless. Next, cookery was fireless, telegraphy was wireless, cigars were nicotineless, and coffee caffeineless. Soon oranges were seedless, the putting green was weedless, the college boy was hatless, the proper diet fatless. New motor roads are dustless, the latest steel is rustless, our tennis courts are sodless, our new religion godless. We have come to a point now of seeing life in a way that we in the West are trying to define without God. You know, I've just got off a plane 3 days ago. I've been gone for about a month, speaking the last week in Hong Kong. And you talk to an average Chinese who has just come out of China, and they will tell you it's the fastest growing church in the world. They tried it the godless way, and it cost them tens of millions of lives in the process because somebody had to play God. And I would speak there day after day, night after night, and see powerful Chinese Christian businessmen and women, brilliant young students. And one night speaking to political leadership at a club, and they would listen and listen and listen. And they are hungry to find out what the Christian faith is all about and how its ramifications work out in culture. While they are pursuing that way, we are trying to find out how to go the godless way out here. It's a strange affliction that has stricken the West, that has lived off the capital and the bequest of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And now we want to stand planting our feet firmly in midair. It's a tragedy. The idea is this: if there is no moral lawgiver who is transcendent to you and me, then there is no moral law by which we must dictate our lives except the moral law that we invent for ourselves. Now, I want you to follow this very carefully, because this is not an argument easily understood. I get it again and again and again, and I got it from a brilliant Fulbright scholar last week in Hong Kong. And they generally will listen to something I've said on tape or written, and then I can predict what the question is going to be. Actually, if you walk into any university campus, if you give me a blank sheet of paper, I'll write out 20 questions and tell you these are the questions for tonight. I haven't heard a new one in a long, long time. Oh, names may change, ideas don't. Malcolm Muggeridge said all new news is old news happening to new people. And so I tell a story of this time I was in the University of Nottingham many, many years ago. It was in the early days of apologetics, very daunting. And a student shot up out of his seat and he just shouted at me and he said, "There cannot be a God because there's too much evil in this world." I said, "Remain standing, I'd like to interact with you. When you say there's evil, aren't you assuming that such a thing is good?" He said, "Yes." I said, "When you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil?" He struggled with that for a moment because he knew he was possibly going into some quicksand. But you see, you can't struggle with that for a moment. You have to say, is there a moral law? Bertrand Russell, when he was debating the Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston, Copleston said to him in their debate, which is given in Russell's book, Why I'm Not a Christian, Copleston says to him, do you believe in the difference between good and bad? He said, yes. How do you differentiate between it? Bertrand Russell said, the same way I differentiate between blue and green. Copleston said, wait a minute, you differentiate between blue and green by seeing, don't you? He said, yes. How do you differentiate between good and bad? And Russell said, on the basis of feeling. What else? Copleston was a kind man. He really should have said, Mr. Russell, in some cultures they love their neighbors, in other cultures they eat them. Both on the basis of feeling. Do you have any personal preference? And I told that story to this fellow. He said, okay, I guess there has to be a moral law. I said, you say there's too much of evil in this world. When you say there's evil, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you assume there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. He said, I'll grant you that. I said, but if you assume a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver, but that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? I promise you this is exactly what happened. He looked at me. He said, what then am I asking you? I said, I'm not going to help you if you don't know what the question is. But you know, he was caught in the moment of experiential inescapability. Here he was trying to argue too much evil. But in experience, it suddenly came down to the heart, and he thought to himself, why am I asking this? Because if I'm a real naturalist, there's no such thing as evil. We're all dancing to our DNA. That's what Richard Dawkins said. Now, here's the point, and I want you to follow me. Why do we have to have a moral lawgiver? That's the big gap that the questioner cannot seem to cross. They'll say something like, all right, I say there's such a thing as evil, I assume there's good, I assume there's such a thing as a moral law. Why do I have to go to a moral lawgiver? In fact, the guy who questioned me in Hong Kong on this subject put the question in these words. You know, as evolution came about and we developed our pragmatic ways, we came about to barter things, and currency came into being, and economics and so on. Why can't we arrive at morality the same way? Evidently, he hadn't given too much thought to the economics of today. What value is money in itself? Nothing. In fact, you ask an average economist, what is money? They really don't have the answer. And so we go and borrow without the ability to repay, and we print money without a standard, and we are digging ourselves into total economic chaos. Because we don't have an ontic referent for its real value. Morality has no value unless it has something transcending itself that gives itself the value. And every time you raise the question of evil, follow me now. Every time you raise the question of evil, it is either raised by a person or about persons. You don't ask a question like, why does this wood rot? It's terrible that this wood rots. I feel so badly for this wood. No. Why did 10,000 people die? Why the tsunami? It is always raised by a person or about persons. And if the question is of any value, it can only be of value if persons are of value. And the only way a person can have value if there is a transcendent being of infinite worth who has given you that intrinsic worth, not given to you by state or law or by any other fiat will or something else. Which means morality is not an abstraction. It is woven into personhood. The moral law has no value in and of itself unless there is a moral lawgiver of intrinsic worth, by virtue of which all other value pertains.